This is our third and final lecture on Plato's Timaeus. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about Plato and time. And this will involve also considerations of questions of calculation, ratio, adequation, all terms that will become important to us, particularly as we look at figures like Derrida and Heidegger, as well as Descartes, of course. Now, it is in Plato, as we've already looked at briefly, Heidegger's criticisms of Plato for, as we said last time, or not last time, but in our lecture on metaphysics, for bifurcating the realm of the supersensible ideal and the realm of becoming, and so that he says this gap opens up between them. And so Plato, as an idealist, makes the realm of the ideal practically inaccessible to us. This is something that is going to be questioned in the thought, particularly of Heidegger. But I think we can see this tendency pretty clearly if we look at Plato's comments on time in his essay on Timaeus. And I would, suggest to you that if we think a bit about Plato and time, this is perhaps the best dialogue to go to for beginning to think about this problem. There are other texts out there that are worth looking at as well that are related. One that I would, if you want to continue to pursue the question of time in Neoplatonic thought, for instance, I would urge you to have a look at Augustine's Confessions, particularly the latter portion of it, where he says a great deal about Plato and time, and he has a really interesting meditation on time there. And I think it's probably in the articulation that one finds of it in Augustine that is one of the most clear expositions of Platonic time that I'm aware of anywhere in Western philosophy. So again, that's Augustine's Confessions. Okay, let's read a quote here from Plato, which will begin to give us a sense of this question. This is again from Timaeus. Plato says, "The nature of the living being was eternal, and it was not possible to bestow this attribute fully on the created universe. But God determined to make a moving image of eternity." This is what we've discussed last time in the realm of becoming. "And so when he ordered the heavens, he made in that which we call time an eternal moving image of the eternity which remains forever at one. For before the heavens came into being, there were no days or nights or months or years," this time as timeless, "but he devised them and brought them into being at the same time as the heavens. For they are all parts of time, just as past and future are forms of it, which we wrongly attribute to the eternal being. We say, it was and shall be, but on a true reckoning, we should only say is, reserving was and shall be for the process of change in time." Okay, again, note here, we should only say is because the realm of being is the realm of what is. It is what we made this distinction between, we said the world of being is what is true. The world of seeming is the world of becoming, is what seems or appears to be true. We're making a distinction here between what is true and what seems to be true. And what is true, always will be true, always was true for Plato, and so is in some sense timeless. "For both are motions, but that which is eternally the same and unmoved can neither be becoming older or younger owing to the lapse of time, nor can it ever become so, neither can it now have become, nor can it come to be in the future." All right, now what is interesting here, I think there's a question that we're going to have to think a little bit more about, is this last sentence where he says, here again. Let me read it. That neither can it now have become, nor can it come to be in the future. All right, so this certainly would suggest that that what is cannot become in the world of becoming. It is again transcendental, completely beyond the world of the realm of becoming, and so as such, time, we say the essence of time does not disclose itself to us as an event in time. All right, let me say that again. The essence of time does not disclose itself to us for Plato as an event in time. All right, now we're going to need to begin talking about, as we get deeper into some of this material, we're going to need to begin to make distinctions between, truth as something that can be calculated, that can be known, and truth as something that is disclosed in a temporal sense. And this would be Plato's really talking about here what contemporary theorists like Zizek, Derrida, and others will speak of the event of truth disclosure. This would be event with a capital E. This would be an event that would be so far beyond our ability to calculate that we don't really, it leaves us a bit befuddled. We're going to look also briefly in this lecture at what Derrida has to say about the difference between, calculation, truth that is calculable, and truth that is beyond our ability to calculate and requires, when we're in the midst of uncertainties, we're required to make decisions without knowing, in the night of unknowing. And we'll talk more about this also with reference to what Derrida calls the ordeal of undecidability, which is making decisions that are when we're dealing with something that is beyond our ability to calculate in any way that's easy. Okay, all right. I'm going to press forward here. Plato says here, let's continue. He says, we use expressions, such expressions as what is past, what is present, and what is future. Notice there the italics, and what is not, none of which is strictly accurate. Time came into being with the heavens in order that, having come into being together, they should also be dissolved together if ever they are dissolved. The sun and moon and the 5 planets came into being to define and preserve the measures of time. All right. Okay, there's a lot there also to think about. So I would urge you to meditate on this passage as well, because again, you can see here, let's read again. Time came into being with the heavens in order that, having come into being together, they should also be dissolved together. So time, in this sense, in the way that Plato is describing it here, is something that itself will pass into non-being, because again, it is something that is related to the world of becoming. Now note here this later sentence. We've already talked a bit about the armillary sphere and the circuits inside the head that have constellations embedded upon them, which are akin in effect to geometrical forms, as we'll explore. But here he's saying, no, that the moon and the sun and the 5 planets came into being to define and preserve the measures of time. And so we're going to see again, it is precisely the stars in the sky, the constellations above, that enable us to begin to understand what time is. Okay, this is why, as we're going to see, Plato's going to say, our eyes are the greatest gifts that the gods bestow upon us, because they enable us to discover time and therefore philosophy itself. All right. Now, I'd like here, as we get a little deeper into this question of calculation related to the constellations in the sky and the constellations in the armillary sphere that is your brain for Plato, which is a kind of a calculating machine in effect. I think we need to spend just a moment and pause here on this question of the psyche's invisibility. Now we said we said previously that the soul or the psyche as something that partakes of being, it is an eternally existing intangible essence. But it's something that exists in the realm of being, and so as such, like what he's calling the eternal being in the quote that we just read, doesn't disclose itself to us. And so we talked about this last time about looking in the eyes. You don't see the soul as a sort of thing in itself. To put it in Kantian terms, it doesn't appear within the framework of in any empirical sense, the framework of vision. All right, so we have this notion in Plato that the soul, we could think of the soul as a kind of, or the psyche as an absent present entity, something that really, again, is there, but it doesn't really present itself to us as such. Now, later, we'll talk about what Heidegger calls the principle of reason. Now, this comes from the philosophy of Leibniz, who says, basically, for everything there is a reason. Now, Leibniz's thought comes to be construed as a kind of a naive optimism, say, for instance, in Voltaire's Candide, when we have, Pangloss, this eternally optimistic philosopher. But Leibniz's thinking on what Heidegger calls the principle of reason is a little bit more complex than that. That's a kind of a brutal parody of Voltaire's. But what Heidegger is going to explore in his book on the principle of reason, which is an exploration of Leibniz's principle that he articulates. Remember, I said earlier, two main principles that you need to know: the principle of non-contradiction, principle of reason. Those are the only two, along with the main concepts of metaphysics. So these would be two things that you need to know. Now, we'll come back to the principle of reason, but I just want to say briefly here that the way Heidegger is going to read the principle of reason is that when Leibniz says for everything there is a reason, Heidegger observes that means that also in a metaphysical sense, for everything there is a ground, a present absent ground. And this ground that is presently absent, since it doesn't appear in any empirical way in the world of becoming, like the eternal being we were just reading about in Plato, in this quote on time from Plato, it must be represented. All right, so this is part of the another way in which Heidegger is going to read Leibniz's principle that this mandate that reason must be rendered, which is another way of saying reason must be represented. That whatever reason is, logos we're talking about here, it has to be represented. Okay, because it doesn't appear as such. The psyche and the word, which is the soul, the word that's inscribed on the soul, the rational part of your soul, which is logos, it must be represented. It must be represented because it doesn't appear to us as a thing in itself. Okay, so let's look what Plato says here. He says the only existing thing capable of intelligence we must call soul or psyches, the Greek, and soul or psyche is invisible. Whereas fire, water, earth, and air are all visible bodies. Okay, these are the four primal elements. And so, again, in the realm of becoming, all of these things can be observed and measured, but the invisible soul does not appear like the eternal being we were just reading about in the previous paragraph in the realm of becoming, or like, for instance, time. All right, now, there's a quote that I like to remind my students of whenever we're going over this material. This is a kind of a catchphrase that you can remember to come to terms with what Plato is calling the logos and the psyche here. And as he calls the logos in Phaedrus, the truly existing intangible essence. Okay, so I would encourage you to memorize that little phrase. The logos is the truly existing intangible essence. All right, now, that's kind of a contradiction there, right? It's truly existing, but it's intangible, right? It really is there, but it's not there in any way that's tangible. So we can think of it as the present, absent soul. The soul is presently absent, or it is a structure that is both there and not there at the same time, because it's not nothing. It's not a quarrel nothingness. It is really there, but it is absent from our ability, or we don't have, unlike the four primal elements, we have no way to directly have any kind of perception or apprehension of it. Okay, now I'm going to draw your attention here for just a moment to a very famous reading that is often anthologized. And so if you may be familiar with this. If not, I would encourage you to become familiar with it, because it's a very helpful way, like the armillary sphere, this image of this painting that Michel Foucault has discussed at length in his book, Les mots et les choses, I think wrongly translated as the order of things. It should literally be words and things. I think that would have been a better translation. But nonetheless, this is a wonderful book by Foucault. By the way, there's a fascinating, towards the end, you get, Derrida had a very brutal critique of Foucault, his Madness and Civilization. There's a whole big, debate about that developed. And here you find Foucault's very terse, but powerful, I think, in many ways, rejoinder to Derrida. So there's an interesting critique of Derrida at the conclusion of this text. So if you want to get into that Foucault-Derrida exchange, it's there. Now, they had much in common. Foucault was actually Derrida's teacher, but they had kind of a falling out after Derrida's critique of this text by Foucault, Madness and Civilization. In any case, Foucault, like Derrida, is a figure who Jordan Peterson and Noam Chomsky demonize in a lot of their discourse. Foucault was arguably more interested in questions of power than Derrida. So there are some aspects of Jordan's critique when he speaks of the pursuit of power in what he wrongly calls postmodern Marxism, because Foucault is kind of hostile to Marxist discourse anyway. He certainly saw himself as having broken from it. But in any case, this you can see on the cover here, this painting which that Foucault reads, and I want to just show it to you here for a minute. I'm taking this from Foucault, so this is inspired by Foucault. You can see here this painting. Also, Picasso did a variation on this Velasquez painting, and again, it's a helpful tool. But I would urge you look for a moment at the painting on your left. This is one of the most famous paintings in history. I'm sure most of you've seen it at one time or another. But if you notice, you have a painter who has on the far left, who holds a brush in his hand. The tableau is facing him, not us. And we're as viewers, we're structured into the painting as if the people that are in the painting and the painter himself is looking at us. Now, in the far wall, we see a mirror, and in that mirror, we see an image of the sovereign and the king and the queen, whom the painter is painting. All right. Now, I like to use this image to help better understand what we were just discussing, because we can see here again, in which we're calling the principle of reason, that reason must be represented, that the ground of being is such, the metaphysical ground, which is presently absent, this thing that is a thing but not accessible in any way in the realm of becoming, particularly in the way that Plato bifurcates the supersensible from the world of becoming, is represented in this mirror in the far wall. And so we see the sovereign, the king and the queen, as in an empirical sense, because they are spectral images that appear on that far mirror. But the ground of their sovereignty, their metaphysical ground, does not appear. All right. So this might be an image that I hope will help illustrate in a vivid way this question of the soul's invisibility that we've just explored in Plato. And there's Picasso's riff on it. Picasso is such a wonderful painter. Maybe we'll come back to this later. Okay, so here's what Plato says. Then let's talk about this as sight, because again, this is a matter. We're talking about a sight as being, as we said earlier, the greatest good that the gods have given to us. So let's read it in Plato's own language. He says, "The sight of day and night, the months and the returning years, the equinoxes and the solstices, has caused the invention of number." There we go. For a number is, for math and for calculation. "Given us the notion of time and made us inquire into the nature of the universe. Thence we have derived philosophy, the greatest gift the gods have ever given or will give to mortals. This is what I call the greatest goods our eyes give to us." All right. So here, very fascinating passage, very revealing passage, because we get philosophy from our eyes, because it's through our eyes that we look at the motions of the stars above us and their cyclical nature, and so the way that the constellations keep coming back, and so we begin, primitive peoples begin to be able to measure time, to be able to take the measure of time. And so, and because this is so, they're also able to begin thinking about, philosophy itself. Now, time, the question of time, as we'll see, is also, and as well as obviously the question of the Quora, the abyss, is linked to the question of death, because the time that we're talking about, to put it in Heideggerian terms, is our time, the time that is given to us, which is limited. We don't live, at least in the realm of becoming, we don't live forever. We only have a small amount of time that is allotted to us. Nobody knows how much time they have. And Heidegger is going to suggest, as we'll see, that one of the reasons why contemporary theorists, philosophers often don't want to engage the question, the problem of the Quora, or non-being, is because to do so would inevitably force them into a consideration of their own limited time, or their own mortality, of the question of what happens to them, when they cease to be. And this is a question that makes us often uncomfortable. But to do philosophy, to ask this question, why are there beings other than nothing at all, which is for Heidegger the question that is first in rank, we have to be willing to put the question of our own death into play, which is to say, we have to think about the question of time. And so time in this sense is linked to the question of death. But it's, for Plato, something that we learn about through our eyes. All right, it's a gift that the eyes are a gift that God gives to us. And so we want to stop and here just think about eyes for a minute, because, for instance, you'll find as a theme that runs throughout Heidegger's work, as he says often, that the Greeks are eye people. So think of Plato as an eye person, and we're going to explore this more in Phaedrus, in the sense that we're going to see that truth and beauty are finally equivalencies for Socrates, or they're equivalent to one another. That the true is inevitably the beautiful, and so Greek, particularly Hellenic philosophy, is certainly fascinated by beauty and by the question of the beautiful, eternal beauty, certainly. And beauty in this sense comes to us through the eyes. And so Heidegger, too, as someone who follows the Greeks, is also a kind of an eye person, much like Plato. Now, I mentioned this because we're going to see, like, one of the important contrasts between the thought of Derrida and Heidegger is that Derrida, by contrast, is very critical of the let's say the relentlessly visualist nature of Hellenic and Heideggerian thought. And we're going to find, by contrast, in Derrida, an emphasis on blindness. That true seeing is seeing that is blind. You might think of sort of Paul on the road to Damascus, who sees the light, and the light causes him to lose his sight. And of course, this is also linked to the question of Derrida. One of the obvious differences between, let's say, Derrida and Heidegger is that Derrida comes from a Jewish background, and Heidegger, was raised in a Catholic tradition. In fact, he wrote his dissertation on Thomas Aquinas before he moved to becoming to more of a sort of interested in philosophy and not in a theological sense, but philosophy as philosophy. We're going to see later Heidegger is going to call a Christian philosophy a square circle, that Christianity and philosophy, at least as he understands philosophy, have absolutely nothing to do with one another. But in Heidegger's early thought, he was influenced by Aquinas, not an insignificant fact. But in any case, we find, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, whereas we've already seen the deity of God is, anthropomorphized in Judaism. By contrast, we could say God is the God who hides his face from us, who doesn't disclose himself to us, not in the way that, for instance, in the Christian tradition, when Jesus is crucified on the cross and the veil rips in the temple, and there's this sort of belief in this, the incarnate deity reveals his divinity to us as such. That doesn't happen in Judaism. All right. Well, we'll come back to that. Okay. All right. I want to now, as we go a little bit further now into this question, begin to try to develop a greater sense of what this truth that is linked to vision is, in the thought of Plato, as opposed to a kind of a thinking that is not linked to the empirical evidence that appears before us, a kind of a more pure reflection. We're going to see this difference, in Plato's thought, but we can follow it up in the thought of Descartes. We can see Nietzsche meditating on this, as well as Heidegger and Derrida, although they didn't. I'm not saying that all of their thought is the same on this question. It's certainly not. But all of them are aware and discuss in their own separate ways the difference between, or differences between, truth that can be calculated in an empirical sense, and or thinking that is based in the calculation of empirically verifiable data, and a more purely reflective thinking. This distinction, for instance, that Nietzsche makes between ideas, which are linked to empirical things that we experience, and what Plato calls the realm of becoming, and thought, which is something other than calculation, at least in the thinking of Nietzsche. Okay, let's work on that for just a minute. Okay, so let's get a sense first of what we're calling truth and calculation, and what truth as calculation. We could say there are different words for this in the history of philosophy. Veritas is from the Latin, rectitude, ratio, adequation, serum, or certainty, which is important to Descartes, because Descartes, as we're going to see, and he's very interested in truth that we can know for sure. This is one of the reasons why he becomes so fascinated with mathematics. Now, another way to say this is, when we think of truth as certainty, we're talking about competence. And what is competence? The easiest formulation to understand what competence is to think of competence as correct perception. This is essentially what competence means. It means correct perception. Now, this is true in the history of Western philosophy. It's true in Descartes. It's certainly true in the thinking of Noam Chomsky. This word competence is a word that is very important to him when he differentiates between what he calls universal grammar and the epiphenomenon, which would be the spoken utterance, or the inscribed word, which is a representation of this interior evolutionary this alleged interior evolutionary structure that he claims is hardwired into the brain, that he calls universal grammar, but not much like Plato's ideals in the realm of being, not accessible to us in any empirical way. but the squaring of one with the other, with the writing that is inscribed on our brain, as Chomsky would put it, and the words say that we speak, or the utterance, is in effect, what he calls, competence. All right, but it's linked to the idea of perception, and not just perception, but correct perception, seeing correctly. Okay, now we're going to see later that in the thought of Nietzsche, one of the problems with claims to competence is that the claim that one sees correctly can very quickly degenerate into a power claim rather than a truth claim. Okay. I want to just briefly also draw your attention to the inventor of insurance and the inventor of the calculator, which is the philosopher Leibniz, who we were just discussing. Now, we're going to come back to this later, but I note this because, calculators, calculation, insurance, all of it comes from philosophy. And there is a sense in which, as we're going to see, that the armillary sphere, like the stepped reckoner of Leibniz, this early prototypical computer, is a kind of a calculating machine. They're both machines that are there to, say, calculate truth, to be able to determine what truth is in a correct way, to see with competence, calculate with competence. All right, let's see how Plato talks about this in the Timaeus. He says, the cause and purpose of God's invention and gift to us of sight was that we should see the revolutions of intelligence in the heavens and use their untroubled course to guide the troubled revolutions in our own understanding, which are akin to them. Okay, again, the armillary, the constellations in the head that circulate around that fire in itself, and then the constellations in the sky. And so by learning what they are and how to calculate them according to their nature, correct the disorder of our own revolutions by God's standard. All right, so there is, again, a linking of what is on the inside with what is on the outside, and that really is what ratio is. We can think of when the structures, the forms that are innate within us, within our brains, within our minds, square with what they see in the external empirical world when they're held in a correct proportion to one another. That is ratio. Okay, so we said the armillary sphere is a kind of a calculating machine. All right, so here's how Plato articulates this. He says, when another kind of fire, other than logos, or the fire in itself, which would be the fire, the external fire, with a faster motion falls on the visual ray and penetrates it right up to the eyes, it forces apart and dissolves passages in the eyes and causes the discharge of a mass of fire and water, which we call a tear. This incoming fire meets a fire moving toward it, and the outgoing fire leaps out like lightning, while the incoming is quenched in the moisture. The result is a confusion of all kinds of colors. This we call dazzling, and the object it produces bright and gleaming. Okay, now here is a, let's say, this is a early articulation of what one might also call dialectical thinking, is subjective, objective, dialectical thinking, when the subject becomes the subject of the object and the object is construed as the object of the subject. One squares with the other. All right. So Plato speaks when he speaks of this divine form, or this ball of fire which burns in the center of the brain. He says the divine form, God, made mostly of fire, so that it should be as bright and beautiful to look at as possible. And he made it spherical like the universe, and he set it to follow the movement of the highest intelligence. The fixed stars are living beings, divine and eternal, and remain always rotating in the same place. Okay, again, so these gods that we look up in the sky are actual, these stars that are gods are actual divine living beings, and they are eternal. Now, okay, one way we've talked about these innate, using this somewhat anachronistic language, because innate ideas are linked to Descartes, as we're going to see, but these forms, these ideals that are let's say pre-embryonic and eternal, are akin to, for Plato, geometrical forms. Now, we're not going to go into all of his discussions of triangles that we find and other geometrical forms in the Timaeus, but I just want to note this, at least in passing, that for Plato, that the triangle is what he calls here. As you can see, he says logic and likelihood both require us to regard the pyramid as the solid figure that is the basic unit or seed of fire. So here we have what we called last time, we've got seed of fire riding on the soul. Now he's talking about it, its most basic unit being well, it's most akin to the pyramid. Now, some have speculated. There's Plato, after the death of Socrates, Plato is said to have gone to Egypt for a while, and some have speculated that maybe that's where he learned his idealist philosophy. Hard to say. If he learned it there, it would certainly have been a late development, because Egyptian thinking is not in any sense Platonic. It's very different from the thought of Plato. But in any case, it's interesting here to find another connection between Plato and ancient Egypt. All right. Plato famously said that it was, well, on the walls of his academy, it was said that he had inscribed, "Let no one who is destitute of geometry enter my doors." All right. So even as a condition to study in Plato's academy, one had to spend time studying geometry. Right, here's how he articulates this difference between truth that can be calculated and which is and well, what we're going to call here opinion versus intelligence. Here's Plato. "If, as some think, there is no difference between true opinion and intelligence, what we perceive through our senses must be taken as the most certain reality. Now, there is no doubt that the two are different, because they differ in origin and nature. One is produced by teaching or dialectics, and we'll talk about this in our reading of Phaedrus, and the other by persuasion or rhetoric. One always involves truth and rational argument. The other is irrational. One cannot be moved by persuasion. The other can. True opinion is a faculty shared. It must be admitted by all men. Common sense, in fact. Intelligence by the gods, and only a small number of them." Okay, so we find Plato here wanting to distinguish between, this a kind of a thinking that is divine, which is linked to the intelligence given to us by God and by the gods, which is what philosophers engage in. This would be philosophy or reflection, asking the questions like the question of Heidegger, why are there beings rather than nothing at all, as opposed to opinion. And opinion is something that is linked to the experience of the sensual. Right now, the way Nietzsche is going to say this in his little book, Anti-Education, or at least as it's been recently translated, this is one of Nietzsche's early books. He's going to say, "It is not enough to have ideas. One must have thoughts." All right, so this is a distinction that's worth pausing on for just a minute. Now, remember here in the way that Nietzsche means this, that the etymology of the word idea is linked to the visual. An idea is something that one can see. And so when Nietzsche differentiates here, much like Plato, the difference between what he's calling ideas and thoughts, he's speaking of that which comes to us through the experience of the sensual realm and enters into our body as a trace, but that's different from what he's calling thoughts, which would not be something linked to the realm of the sensual. So we're going to find this is one of the reasons why Nietzsche is going to write in aphorisms, and he's going to ask, well, where do thoughts come from? Do they come from the sensual realm, or they steal upon us in strange ways? All right, now this precedes or anticipates what we'll talk about when we get to the Rene Descartes' Discourse on Method. This is actually from his Meditations on First Philosophy. It's a concise differentiation of what Descartes calls the adventitious versus the innate ideas. Now, this is again, they're not all. It's not the same as what we've just been talking about, but it's very similar, and I hope that it can give you some sense of what we've been talking about. So this is another key and crucial notion that you'll find in Descartes. And so this is something that you should know the difference between. This is going to be particularly important when we look at differences between Descartes and the British empiricism. And so we can say just briefly, an adventitious idea is a path-dependent an idea that comes to us like what we were just talking about in the thought of Nietzsche, via the realm of the senses. And Descartes is going to suggest that animals, for instance, are adventitious ideas are available to animals. This would be, for instance, we could say, well, like a dog or a cat can be curious and can like sniff around, smell around, but that doesn't mean that a dog or a cat does philosophy, or at least that's the claim. All right. An innate idea, by contrast, would be more akin to what Nietzsche is calling thought in the previous quote, although that doesn't mean Nietzsche by any means embraces the Cartesian notion of innate ideas, which we're going to see that come to be challenged very radically by the British empiricists, particularly figures like Locke and even more particularly David Hume. All right, here's how Rene Descartes articulates this difference between adventitious and innate ideas. And he also is going to add a third category of ideas that we invent ourselves, that we make up ourselves in a fanciful way. Descartes says, some ideas appear to me to be innate. Already, like think of it as, Chomsky, for instance, will speak of innate ideas as being, genetically transmitted. Part of the hard wiring that's in our brain is one way of thinking about an innate idea. Some adventitious, these are the ones that are path-dependent ideas that come to us through the senses, and others invented by myself. For as I have the power of understanding what is called a thing or a truth or a thought, it appears to me that I hold this power from no other source than my own nature. But if I now hear some sound, if I feel the sun or heat, I have hitherto judged that these sensations proceed from something outside of me. And finally, it appears to me that sirens, hippogriffs, and the like are formed by my own mind. And so we can make up fanciful ideas, but in effect, the adventitious ideas and innate ideas are not those that we invent. They, particularly adventitious, is one that is empirically experienced. Okay, and the innate idea is again always already there. As in a metaphysical, in an explicitly metaphysical sense, in the thought of Descartes, and in the thought of Chomsky, by contrast, innate ideas are said to be evolutionary structures that are organic. He claims that what he calls, for instance, universal grammar is, he says, it's as real as the liver. But what this universal grammar has in common with the Cartesian innate idea, even though Descartes is metaphysical and Chomsky claims that his is biological, but in both cases they are theses that these different thinkers assert, since Descartes' innate idea as a metaphysical idea doesn't appear in the realm of becoming. To put it in Platonic terms, it's not something that we have access to via the realm of the senses. Chomsky claims that universal grammar, which he also calls an innate idea, is as real as the liver, but the obvious difference between the liver and this organ that he's calling universal grammar, which, if it is an organ, is that I can open up my my belly and I can pull out the liver out of my torso and put it in a jar or hold it up and show it to you. It's empirically observable. but this so-called organ that he's calling universal grammar remains a thesis or a hypothesis, since it's never appeared to us in any way, in any empirical sense. It's a claim that Chomsky makes. Okay, I'd like to conclude with a reference to a quote from Derrida. It's an interesting quote that I hope can provide food for thought as we try to come to terms with this question of differences between what truth that can be calculated in a Cartesian sense, or in the sense that we've seen discussed in Plato, and that which is beyond calculation, requires therefore a decision on our part. Here's Derrida. Derrida states, this is from his volume 2 of his book on the death penalty, which he was very much opposed to. Derrida states, calculation is always busy, preoccupied, interested, provoked, put into motion by what remains properly incalculable. If that which is subject to calculation were calculable, if calculation were not always dealing with the incalculable, there would never be a problem. There is calculation and a problem of calculation, a crisis of calculation, indecision or undecidability of calculation, and thus the responsibility of a decision. Only there where we no longer know what calculation means, no more than what we know what to do. Excuse, that should be no. Sorry, misspelling there. No more than what we know what to decide means, and we must not pretend to know what either of these things mean. All right, so there's one could say, well, that's obscurantism, but it's Heideggerian obscurantism, if that's what it is, because it takes a more inductive approach, a more humble approach. Heidegger's going to say questioning is the piety of thought, and that philosophy really begins with the asking of a question, or what Derrida will call the question of the question, which another way to say this is that we don't know. We begin to do philosophy not by knowing, but by not knowing, and that's quite different from the Cartesian position, which is metaphysical in the same way that Plato's is, in that it's predicated on a claim to certainty, a truth that can be calculated and known for sure. And as we're going to see later, when Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," and when Descartes says God exists, I can know that, he makes both of these claims. The existence of the self and of God are not faith-based claims. They are claims that are truth claims, in effect. This is one of the reasons why the Church, the Catholic Church, regarded Descartes as a heretic, because Descartes essentially does away with faith. So Kant is later going to say, I had to do away with truth to make room for faith. And so, what Derrida is saying here, it's not all that obscure when you position it in the framework of the history of philosophy, because what he's saying is something not so different from what Kant says. And I think this is a very humble statement, and it also tells us something about responsibility. That we sometimes have to make decisions without knowing. And just because we can't have certainty doesn't mean that we don't have to decide. So this, again, is going to be linked to what Derrida and specters of Marx would call the ordeal of undecidability. Okay, that's going to conclude this discussion of Plato and time. Again, in all three of these lectures, I've tried to identify key quotes. I'm sure that there's material here that has left you a little befuddled, particularly if you're coming to this for the first time. But this is a beginning, and I would urge you to look at these passages when you do the reading on your own time, to read them and to reread them, and to do so with the kind of humble, questioning spirit that we find in the work of Derrida. And so I will conclude on that, and in our next lecture, we will turn our attention to Plato's Phaedrus, which is also, I think, one of the most important dialogues for students of literature.